Happy Friday. Welcome back to the Lorden Arts channel. I'm John Lorden. Thank you so much for spending some time with us here today on BrainScratch. Before we get to today's episode, just want to let you know that we will have no shows next week. Christy and I are going to take the week off. We hope that you guys enjoy some special time with your friends and family through the holiday, and we'll see you back the week following. For today's episode, several of you are going to say, John, you've already talked about this. This is an episode of Case Cracked. Is it? Or is this Case Uncracked? Janelle Matthews was 12 years old when she went missing. Her body would eventually be found. The true crime community would be stunned when the person accused of that crime was arrested, and several of us found out he was a follower of our content. In some cases, as in mine, he was a patron. So if you're unfamiliar with that story, we're going to go ahead and take you back to Case Cracked so you know all the basics. Then we're going to bring you back here where we're going to interview Ed Dentzel from the UNFOUND podcast. Why? Because Ed actually took the stand at this trial. We'll be back in just a few moments. 7th grader Janelle Matthews was a very outgoing, independent young woman. Adopted by Jim and Gloria Matthews in March of 1972, she was taken into their home where she grew and flourished with their daughter Jennifer. She was active in her community, school, and loved attending services at Sunnyview Church of Nazarene near their home in Greeley, Colorado. On December 20th, 1984, she would be singing with her middle school honor choir in a televised concert at the Intrawest Bank of Denver. She was very excited to be on television and was looking forward to the evening, even though her family wouldn't be able to attend. At about 5:30 p.m., everyone met at McDonald's to grab a quick meal before they went their separate ways. After dinner, Gloria left to catch a flight to Los Angeles to visit family, and Jim drove Janelle to her concert, where he dropped her off before driving 16-year-old Jennifer to her basketball game. Once the concert was over, Janelle was taken home by a family friend and his daughter, who was a classmate of hers. They arrived at her Avenue Court home at 8:15. Janelle wished everyone good night and Merry Christmas before walking through the open garage door to settle down for the evening. An hour later, Jim came home from Jennifer's basketball game to find the house empty. He could see that Janelle had been home. There was a telephone message that she had taken for her father sometime after 8:30. He could also see her socks, shoes, and pillow in front of a space heater in the TV room. Assuming she walked over to see their neighbors, he started to wrap presents and waited for her to come home. At 10 p.m., when Jennifer returned from her game, there was still no sign of Janelle. Jennifer also assumed her sister would be home when she got there. At that point, Jim began to panic. They had taught their daughters to always leave notes so no one would worry. After talking with friends, he decided it was time to call the police. By 10:15, law enforcement had arrived at the Matthews home. Then police sergeant and future mayor John Gates was among the officers first to arrive. Quote, "The minute I walked into their home, I thought that this was probably not a runaway," Gates said. Throughout the night, officers combed the neighborhood looking for anything suspicious. There were no signs of a struggle in the home, and the surrounding neighborhood offered only one disturbing clue. Officers found footprints in the snow, indicating that someone had been looking in the windows of the Matthews home. The next day, as Gloria caught a flight home to help search, classmates were questioned, and it was verified that yes, Janelle had sung in the concert, and yes, a family friend indeed took her home. They saw no one at the house when they left. That Christmas, the search for Janelle would eventually encompass hundreds of volunteers and thousands of flyers. All the while, her presents sat unopened under the tree, as her family continued to hope that she would come home to enjoy them. As the investigation continued, investigators found that members of the community seemed to be unnerved by a man named Steve Pankey. Pankey had been a resident of Greeley since the mid-70s and an active member of the Matthews' church, although not a happy one. The congregation had to have the man removed a number of times due to harassment and disruption to services. He lived just 2 miles from Janelle's home and, more disturbingly, had been seen watching school children as they exited the bus in the afternoon. When he was questioned, he stated that the day of Janelle's disappearance, he had been home with his family, getting ready for a trip out of state that was planned for the 22nd. He claimed to not even know that the girl was missing until after they returned 6 days later. After his wife verified his version of events, officers decided to pursue other avenues of interest, but Steve Pankey just wouldn't go away. Shortly after his questioning, Pankey called and met with an FBI agent. He stated that he had heard from his father-in-law, who worked at a local cemetery, that someone had asked him how to get rid of a body. This immediately made law enforcement suspicious. Why wouldn't Pankey have told that to them? Pankey had caused trouble for many people in the community. He seemed to always have a problem, but the problem wasn't him. It was usually everyone else. Prayer vigils were held, and even more searches and flyers would go out over the years. Janelle would even be one of the first children in that area to be featured on a milk carton. Still, investigators had almost no leads. Almost. As investigators continued to look into Pankey's past, they saw that he had a number of disturbing charges that had been leveled against him through the years. In 1977, while he was married and a youth pastor at Sunnyview, he was accused of date rape by a member of his church. This charge, along with several others that he faced throughout the years, were eventually either dropped or downgraded to smaller misdemeanors, such as battery and harassment. The young woman he was accused of assaulting became pregnant from the encounter and would go on to terminate that pregnancy. He soon started to harass that woman and threatened to tell the congregation members about her termination of the pregnancy if she didn't drop the charges. Seeing little choice, she complied. From there, he continued to harass family members, get into fights, including one at Kmart, and was just constantly a thorn in everyone's side. Although Steve Pankey was their only person of interest, they just couldn't find anything to charge him with, even though he continued to talk to anyone who would listen. He claimed he wasn't the only one who lived near Janelle. There were 2 officers that lived on her block. Maybe they had something to do with her disappearance. He would also come under renewed scrutiny when, while attending church services at Sunnyview in 1985, he could be heard muttering "false prophet" under his breath when the pastor announced Janelle would be found safe and returned home. He became so agitated that parishioners had to physically remove him. Through the years, the family hung up posters and sent others to as many law enforcement agencies as they could, along with a reward for information. In later years, they would even sit down with other families who had missing children to try to offer comfort and advice. The family appeared on news segments, talk shows, and were even mentioned by President Ronald Reagan in one of his national addresses. Janelle's birth mother was placed under surveillance. She checked out and was found to have no connection. Finally, in 1994, after losing nearly all hope, Jim and Gloria decided to have Janelle declared legally dead. They had come to the conclusion that she would never be coming home and decided it was time to move away from the area. Soon after the Matthews family moved from Greeley, Pankey moved to Twin Falls, Idaho, where he would continue to make quite an impression. No matter where he went, Pankey had problems with everyone around him. He filed pleadings in both civil and criminal cases that had nothing to do with Janelle Matthews, but many of them contained direct and veiled statements about her disappearance. Statements such as, "It is reasonable for the appellant to believe he would get the death penalty for revealing the location of Janelle Matthews' body." He also wrote, "Without a deal, this case will never be solved." Pankey repeatedly demanded immunity in exchange for information he claimed to possess about Janelle's murder. In an April 2003 court pleading, he asserted the family should be informed that Janelle died before crossing 10th Street and not to give the family hope. These same claims and accusations began appearing in many other places. They appeared in a book he wrote, in interviews he gave to the press, in statements he made to the community, and in an alibi document he provided to police. In 2008, at the funeral held for his murdered son, his wife heard him mutter, "I hope God didn't allow this to happen because of Janelle Matthews." Investigators started to notice that his statements became more and more inconsistent over time. Finally, Pankey decided that he was the only one who could fix the broken law enforcement system that he was a constant victim of. So he ran for governor of Idaho twice and thankfully lost. He also ran for sheriff in nearby Lincoln County and lost that election as well. Finally, late in the afternoon at the end of July in 2019, a young woman's body was discovered by a work crew digging a pipeline near Greeley. An autopsy's DNA analysis would show that not only was it Janelle, she had died from a gunshot wound to the forehead. She was still wearing the clothes she had been wearing the night she disappeared. Greeley police now had a confirmed murder in their hands. Janelle's case had never really been allowed to grow cold, but this discovery was finally what investigators needed to move it forward. When combined with information that came from Pankey's now ex-wife, Angela Hicks, investigators seemed to be getting to the easy part of completing this puzzle. Before leaving on what she called their unexpected trip, Pankey took the family's dogs and dropped them off at an unknown location, never to be seen again. Then, after just a few days in California, he abruptly decided it was time to go home. All the way, she stated that he was listening to the news on the radio, searching for accounts of Janelle's disappearance. When they arrived home on December 26th, he immediately began digging in their backyard, although she never found out why. 2 days later, a car on their property burst into flames and was disposed of at a local salvage yard. Her husband also owned at least one firearm at the time. Most telling of all was the discussion of a few crucial pieces of evidence law enforcement had withheld from the public, specifically that a rake had been used to obliterate shoe impressions in the snow leading from the house, and a blanket had disappeared along with Janelle. When officers found Pankey in Twin Falls and tried to question him, he refused, but then turned to newspapers and television reporters to tell his side of the story. His storytelling continued. At the end of the summer in 2019, officers obtained a search warrant for Pankey's home that included all of his electronics. He still refused to cooperate, even after they found that he had made repeated internet searches about Janelle and then tried to delete all evidence of those searches after Greeley investigators had contacted him. As his stories started to hit the news all over the U.S., people in the true crime community had already taken notice of Pankey and his inconsistencies. Fellow YouTuber and co-host of mine on 3 Men and a Mystery, Gray Hughes, who contributed his research for today's story, thank you, Gray, covered Janelle's case in 2019, and Steve Pankey left a comment on his video stating, "I am innocent. I lived 2 miles away. Without considering police involvement, the case will never be solved." Investigators now believe that on December 20th, 1984, between 8:30 to 9:30 p.m., Pankey took Janelle from her home at gunpoint, using the family's rake to cover their footprints. At some point during the kidnapping, Janelle was shot once in the forehead and died. Pankey then hid her body. Steve Pankey was arrested without incident at his home on Monday, the 12th of October, 2020. He's currently facing multiple charges, including first-degree murder. That's when our true crime community received another shock. At least 5 other creators, including myself, found that Pankey was not just watching our material, but also contributing to our channels as a patron on Patreon. The thought of this man contributing to my channel made me so sick, I'm even having trouble talking about it again today. To think of him watching content of mine and reliving any aspect of his own crime literally makes me sick to my stomach. From my Patreon account, I could see that he liked a fellow true crime podcaster's episode about the Maria Ridulph case, which has very similar elements to this one. I took the amount he had given to me through Patreon, tripled it, and donated it to an amazing charity called Save the Children. You can learn more about them and consider donating yourself at savethechildren.org. Even though we're not aware of direct physical evidence that ties Pankey to the crime, for example, a gun matching a bullet found with her body, the preponderance of circumstantial evidence is staggering, and his own comments are extremely unsettling. As of when this is being recorded, he is innocent until proven guilty. His attorney claims that Pankey is just a man who likes to be the center of attention and had zero involvement in the crime. The prosecutors believe they'll have no problem getting a conviction. And joining me now is Ed Dentzel from Unfound. How are you doing today, Ed?
Spectacular, John. Spectacular. Good to be talking to you.
Absolutely. And once again, I just want to thank you for your help on the episode we did on the Jason Landry case. If you guys didn't see that, it was a really unique episode to be able to have Ed helping us out with that and Jason's father, Kent. I'll have a link to it in the description box down below so you can check that out as well. But Ed, today we're talking about Steve Pankey, and somehow you became part of this trial. How did you hear? Like, what was the initial contact for you being part of this?
He became a Patreon supporter of Unfound in early August of 2019. And as you know, when people sign up to be a supporter, you usually just get like their first name. So I just knew him as Steve. I didn't really, and I just thought it's just like a Patreon supporter like any other. And it wasn't until early September of 2019 when he finally revealed, because I contacted him, thanked him for being a supporter of Unfound, and told him about all these things that he's now eligible for. And then he finally said, well, you know, I'm actually a suspect in Janelle Matthews' murder, and I didn't do it. And eventually we got around to the idea that, well, he wanted me to interview him for the program. And I will tell you, at the time, I had no idea that he had become a supporter of many different programs, including your own. In fact, I think just between, you know, I didn't find out that he was a supporter of yours until well after I did the interview, John.
Yeah.
So I found that out after I did the interview with him in October of 2019. And then the episode came out in November, early November of 2019. But initially, I think there was at least a month there where he was just any other person to me.
Was there any big moments during the interview? Any standout moments for you in terms of your conversation with him?
In the interview?
Yeah.
As my assistants like to say, you know, Steve is an expert at word salad. You know, he can say a lot without use many words without saying a lot. I think probably the most noteworthy part for me was when we talked about Russell Ross, who was the guy who dropped Janelle off at her home that night. And Janelle, of course, went in. And then an hour later, her father shows up and she's not there. And we now know that she was murdered. Well, Russell Ross was a ex-coworker of Steve Pankey's. And I brought that up to him during the interview. And in the interview that I did with Steve, Steve said that he knew maybe just not even a week after Janelle went missing that Russell Ross had been the guy that dropped Janelle off. Whereas I went back when he said that. So this had come up in a prior email exchange I had with him. And I actually looked that up in the meantime. So when he said that during the interview, I brought it up to him. Well, you know, I went back to all the Colorado media publications on newspapers.com from the time, and not one of them ever mentions Russell Ross. And in fact, this day in 2021, you could do a search for Janelle Matthews and Russell Ross. You don't get very many articles that put the two names together.
Sure.
And I brought that up to him and I said, would you be surprised to find out that I looked that up and it doesn't seem like his name was mentioned at all? And that's when Steve said, well, I must have heard it on TV or something. And this, of course, people who think that he is guilty will think, well, maybe he had some secret knowledge of this because, yes, he was on that street and did see his former coworker, Russell Ross, drop her off.
Right.
And I think that's a point in the interview. Of course, it's like a 3-hour and 20-minute interview or something. But to this day, it's still something that I think about. And I have to admit, I don't think maybe that was stressed enough in the trial.
Okay. Okay. So how do you get contacted about the trial? Where do you first hear that you're going to be part of this?
This happened in early September of 2021. I got an email from Michael Rourke's assistant saying, would you have time in a couple days to speak to Mr. Rourke about what this interview that you did with Steve, and with the possibility of maybe you going to Greeley, Colorado to testify when the trial happens. I can't remember if I really knew when the trial was going to be happening or starting or not at that time. But I said, sure, I'll talk to him. Absolutely. And so whenever it was in early September, a few days after that, I was on the phone with him. I know that Detective Cash was also involved in that conversation. And there were probably other people listening, but those are the two names or two voices that I heard. And we had about a 20-minute conversation. And he did ask me how it all came about. And then eventually he asked, well, would you be available when the trial happens? Would you be available to come out to Greeley and testify? And I have to admit, I asked him, who's paying for this, me or you? He said, well, we would, you'd be flying out on our dime, we'd put you up on our dime and everything. And I said, yeah, I'll be there.
Yeah. Yeah. Us in this true crime social media space, we got to watch the pennies. So yeah, I totally understand that.
That's exactly right. I really needed an answer to that just to be sure.
Yeah. So Ed, was it about that same point that you had brought up that Steve was talking about with noticing who had dropped off Janelle, or was there something else about the interview that they wanted you there for?
I know now. I have to admit, before being involved in the trial and seeing the strategy that they were going to use and trying to prove his guilt, it was a little unclear to me.
Okay.
After the fact, I can tell you now, doing this interview, that they wanted to portray Steve as a liar. And I think they did a very good job of that. And my interview served that purpose, because he said many things in that interview that in other interviews, he said things differently.
Okay. So they were trying to impeach his information, basically.
That's exactly right. Okay. And in fact, eventually, when Steve got on the stand, he admitted that many of the things he said to me in the interview that I did with him were lies. For example, his father-in-law never really did come over and speak to him, tell him, hey, it's going to look bad for you, this body. That never happened. Now, I will tell you that I didn't really believe that story anyway.
Yeah.
It just, because in the interview that I did with him, after he stated that, I said, well, did you ever tell your wife about this, being that it's her father? No. Did you ever speak to your father-in-law again? No. Did that topic ever come up again? No. It just didn't sound very believable to me. Well, I guess my suspicions were correct, being that eventually when he took the stand, he said, no, that never happened.
Okay. Now they fly you out. Are you there for the entire trial? Or are you just there for a day? How was that?
No, I flew out there on October 20th, which is a Wednesday, and I flew back on October 23rd, which was a Saturday. And I was on the stand from about mid 11:30 on Saturday, or on Thursday, until they stopped at 4 something that afternoon. And then I came back the next morning. We started at about 20 till 9, and I was off the stand probably by just 5 after 9 or 10 after 9.
Okay.
I was just there for that amount of time. They put me up in a hotel, which was across this park from the courthouse. And then I came back here to Florida the next day.
What was it like seeing Steve?
I'm going to admit, I never looked him in the eye while I was there.
Really?
I saw him. He saw me, obviously, but I never looked him in the eye at any point. And it's interesting because the courthouse there, or the courtroom, is a little weird. Everybody gets this idea of Law and Order, where the witness is sitting up, you're sitting right next to the judge and the jury. In this, if the jury, if the gallery is like looking north, the judge is looking south, so they're facing each other. The jury's on one side, and I'm on the other side of the room, actually facing the jury.
Oh, okay.
And because of that, I was very close to the defendant's table. I was very close to Steve. And so the whole time I'm on the stand, I'm less than 30 feet from him.
Yeah. Yeah.
The whole time. And that was a little weird. But once again, he and I never locked eyes on each other at any point.
Okay. Okay. So prosecutors before the trial were actually stating that they were going to have no problem getting a conviction. It's part of the reason why we rolled our episode of Case Cracked. We're like, hey, everything looks pretty solid. Looks like this is going to go. We're going to go ahead and record this. But we wound up with a mistrial on counts 1, 2, and 3. Those charges were first-degree murder, felony murder, and second-degree kidnapping. He was found guilty on count 4, which was false reporting, but the sentence for that was only 6 months, which is actually shorter than the time he's already been sitting in jail. So he's already got credit for that amount of time. Yeah. Can you tell us more about count 4? What was that about? Do you know about what the misreporting was?
Is it illegal, when people are being interviewed by the police and they lie about things? Obstruction of justice or something. I'm not a legal expert, but I have to think that there are penalties for when the police come to talk to you about something and you give misleading information. I'm going to guess, once again, I don't know Colorado law, but I'm guessing it has something to do with that. I think what I'm amazed by is there was just one count of it, because I think we now know that Steve lied many times about a lot of stuff.
Right.
So maybe he got off a little light regarding that particular one, only being 6 months.
Do you know what instance in particular, or what conversation in particular? Okay. Okay. Yeah. And I know that there was a lot of strangeness around things he was saying. Online, I know over on Gray's channel, he had commented that this case would never be solved unless you were looking at law enforcement. And it sounded like he was also making comments to law enforcement that he would tell them what actually happened if he got certain protections. He wanted his Fourth and Fifth and Sixth Amendment rights protected. And then as they pressed into those conversations a little bit through the trial, he almost made it sound like he had the information, but it was really based on someone else, and he didn't want to disclose who that person was.
That's right.
I'm almost interested in why they didn't try to charge him as an accessory if he's basically admitting that he has knowledge of the crime at that point. But yeah, I don't know.
The one way I looked at it is that very early on, I think in 1984, 1985, and then I think onward for that, he tried to portray himself as some sort of man of the cloth, and that he had found these things out through some sort of confession. Now, it wasn't Roman Catholic or anything, and being raised Roman Catholic myself, I know a little bit about that. It wasn't anything like that, but I think what he was trying to say was that I found these things out through my position as being a man of the cloth, so it's protected, but I'll tell you if you give me immunity. And then it turns out he was not a man of the cloth. He had not taken any vows of being a priest or a pastor or anything like that, as they discovered that he had misrepresented himself that way when he had spoken to police, about these particular topics. I think that was at least one ploy he tried to use. There probably were others.
Yeah. Outside of seeing yourself on the stand there, what was the most shocking development? I'm sure that you watched or kept track on the rest of the trial once you got home.
Mm-hmm.
What was the big shocker for you?
I have to admit, I don't think that I was, I guess I wasn't even shocked that he lied to me during the interview I did with him. Because I suspected probably some of those things were lies. Because like I said, he just told some stories that didn't make any sense to me, given that doing the program, at least at that time, had been 3 years old. I just really can't put my finger on anything that was necessarily shocking about it. I did, you should know though, I did not follow the trial until after I had testified. Because I wanted to just go in with a clear mind and everything, that I didn't read everything that happened before me until I had already been on the stand and was done. Certainly, Steve's ex-wife, Angela, who I've gotten to know, said some things on the stand that, that got everybody's attention. And I like Angela very much. We've gotten along very well, but I don't think that they had the impact that maybe people thought they should, because she's an ex-wife. She might have, and I hope she was telling the total truth.
Yeah.
But, anytime you have an ex-spouse on there, it's always, even when I do my own program, and sometimes you're not sure what to think.
Yeah, and just to bring you guys into the conversation a little bit, in case you didn't follow the information, she talked about how controlling he was, that he was basically controlling the media that she was reviewing, but also in terms of doing that, there was some strange things, like he would ask her to read him articles about Janelle from several different publications, and to read them over and over to him.
Yeah.
He was digging in places in his yard. There was one instance where he's digging in his front yard. Another instance, he's digging around the septic tank. A car of his just explodes or catches on fire randomly at the property, which I know the prosecution brought up as, hey, when that car burned, what was in it? Potentially in terms of evidence. What I think it's interesting, because when I saw Angela's information, I was like, wow, this is pretty strong stuff. Like, she's there, she's talking about how he's acting. They're coming back from their vacation. He's making her stop to buy newspapers to read about this particular case. It seemed like it was relatively strong, but then you have this aspect of she's telling them about locations, like where he was digging and where this car was burned and all that. So you would think that should lead to physical evidence of some kind to help corroborate her instances. And ultimately, it seems like it doesn't, right?
No, none of that turned up to be anything. Maybe it was something at one time. I mean, we could maybe be open to the idea that he did bury something there, but then he went back and moved it.
Right.
And she didn't know about it. Certainly possible. I don't know if there's no proof of that. So it's certainly possible that something like that happened. But yeah, none of those things really went anywhere. Right.
Now, knowing a bit about his personality, hearing it described through you and some of the interactions we've seen online around him, Steve was very vocal before the trial that he was going to take the stand himself, and he was going to, of course, right? He was going to speak for himself. And he wound up doing it, which honestly, I was shocked by. Like, I thought any defense attorney is going to tell him, Steve, no. Especially when you have all these accusations of, oh, he's a storyteller, he's a conspiracy theorist. But maybe they thought that's what would play into it. Maybe showing the jury, look how far out this guy is, might have actually helped in some way. Was there anything in his time on the stand that stood out to you?
I have to admit, I was not surprised that he was going to take the stand. I had a totally different opinion on that.
I knew he would want to. I would just say, I would swear that his legal counsel would say, no way, Steve. But they did.
Yeah, I probably... I don't know. It's once again, I don't know the legal profession that well, but it might have been something along the lines of, if the defense thought the trial was going poorly, that they're not going to put him on the stand. My impression is the way the trial was going to that point is that I thought the defense, caused reasonable doubt, to that point. And so they thought, well, we'll put him up there and, see what happens. So, like I said, I don't think anybody was surprised by what they saw on the stand from Steve Pankey, including him saying that he had been lying, things that he had lied about going back years and years and years.
Yeah.
But, this, once again, there's just nothing that really stood out to me. But I realized that, having talked about this with you off the air before we did this interview, that your impression of the trial was much different than mine.
Yeah. So, and through the eyes of, I'm looking at news stories and trying to piece this together. I wasn't actually, watching the video footage. I did watch some of the video footage, but not, not like the court TV where we'd be glued to the screen back in the day.
Yeah, well, it really wasn't on court TV, I don't think, that much. I know that, having been in the courtroom myself, there weren't any cameras in there when I was there.
Yeah.
So I think they got the opening arguments. Maybe they did closing arguments, but I don't think, and maybe when Angela was up there, but I think that was about it.
Yeah. Yeah. Which, that would certainly give the public a different perception.
Yeah.
So District Attorney Michael Rourke, there was actually a little line of questioning he fired off right at the end of Steve's time on the stand. He was asking Pankey for details about the murder itself. Quote, "When you shot Janelle Matthews in the forehead, was she begging for her life?" asked Rourke. "Never happened," Pankey responded. "Did you look in her eyes?" Rourke pressed. "Never happened," Pankey replied. Man.
Mm-hmm.
That's something interesting as well. So they were very clear about what had ended Janelle's life because they obviously found the wound to the forehead. Do you know if there was any forensics around that? Did they find a bullet or a slug? Did you hear anything about any of that?
I didn't hear any. I have not heard anything about that.
Didn't come up in court?
Not that I saw. That I saw. And once again, I've read every article from day one till the jury came out. There was nothing like that. I don't think, I think this particular murder case was very, 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 very light on scientific evidence of any type, which I think in the 21st century is very odd. But I think it just didn't seem to me that they had much physical evidence at all. It
opened some really strong questions in terms of the wound, like, an entry wound to the front of the forehead. Does it mean that the bullet exited through the rear? Obviously, she was probably dumped at this location, so the shooting probably happened somewhere else. That slug could be lost somewhere in a tree, in the ground somewhere.
The thing is, Steve made the comment that she was dead before she crossed 10th Avenue.
Right.
This is what he was told by somebody.
Right.
And this would mean, of course, that if he did have some sort of inside knowledge, which I think everybody doubts, but that would mean certainly, of course, that she was shot far away from where remains were found. Yeah.
Yeah. So what was the biggest gap that you saw in terms of the prosecution? Where were they we know that there's some limited physical evidence. Where were they having trouble really connecting the dots for the jury?
They never could put Steve on that street at that time. That's the big issue. I had a chance to talk to Russell Ross. Although I did not play the recording of the interview that I did with him back in 2019. I did speak to him. I talked about it after the interview with Steve. And I asked him specifically, did you ever get the idea that Steve Pankey was ever following you at any time?
Yeah.
He said no. I even asked him, did you even suspect at any point that Steve could have killed Janelle Matthews? He said no, never entertained the idea at all. And so if the guy who dropped Janelle off doesn't think that he was being followed, and a guy who had a problem with Steve never thought that he could have killed Janelle, that certainly helps the defense quite a bit.
Yeah.
And those are the facts. Yeah. So that was the big problem. They could not put him on that street at that time, no matter if he talked about footprints in the snow and everything else, because to believe that he was there means that he must have been following somebody. He must have been following Russell Ross or something. And if what are you supposed to do with that? I think that was the big problem.
Now, Steve's story is that he was at home getting ready for this trip that he effectively leaves for the next day. Was there any information to support that he was or wasn't at home? Did anything like that come up?
No. Well, it did come up. And I think this once again helped the defense because his own wife, Angela, says she couldn't remember that day where Steve was. He was out. We had a job that he would go to and everything. But, she could not say that he came home at an unusual time or anything else. So I think, once again, that helps the defense, regarding that. So,
yeah. So we had spoken previously and taken a look. He's still a patron of mine, so I can still see his account and see who he's following. There was one account that I had put in my notes based off the Case Cracked episode that I know he was a patron of. And when I went to check there today, he wasn't a patron of that account anymore. So I just want to take a look at this creator and see if they still have a Patreon. Because I'm really, first of all, I'm curious why, Steve's account is still following all of us true crimers.
I don't think he's a supporter of Unfound anymore. I don't
really?
think he is. I don't think he is, no.
I thought I saw him on there. Let me see.
Might be following. Here. I don't.
No. Interesting. Yeah. So yeah, he's still supporting Lord and Arts. He's still supporting The Trail Went Cold. He's still supporting Trace Evidence. He's still supporting Vanished, Already Gone, and a creator called Merc, who I'm not familiar with. That is so weird.
I have to believe he has not been a supporter of, like I said, my memory is that at some point around the time that I interviewed him, November or October, when I interviewed him, when the episode came out in November, I remember checking sometime after that. And I don't think he's been a supporter since then.
So the other account that I was mentioning is one called Honest Outlaw, and Honest Outlaw does gun reviews. Mm-hmm. I know he was a patron of theirs previously. I just pulled them up. Honest Outlaw, still on YouTube, still have their Patreon account. Patreon account is still active. Kind of interesting. So both you and Honest Outlaw got removed from...
I don't know why that is. Maybe Steve thought, well, I got what I wanted out of him to do an interview, and now I don't have to support him. Very cool. Could be. I don't know. And in fact, I have to admit, being that he's been in jail for over a year, it is interesting that he's still with all of these programs.
Yeah, I'm still getting $1 a month from Steve Pankey. Thankfully, okay. I mentioned in the Case Cracked, I donated 3 times the amount up to that point, which I think was $17 or something. I donated it to a cause. I'm gonna have to do another donation here soon. Okay, the rake. We kind of briefly touched on it. Basically, the rake came up as a bit of a point because he seemed to have information about a rake being used to cover up footprints in the snow. Where do you think he got that information, Ed?
Well, then this would go to everybody. I should preface this.
Yeah.
Before we go any further, I have high doubts whether Steve Pankey killed Janelle Matthews. Okay, I've been like this for a while, for a long time. I'll admit it. I could surely be wrong. So anything I'm going to say about this rake goes kind of toward the way I see how this all happened.
Okay.
I think it's very possible. My experience of the last 5 years of disappearances, the fact is that police do say things to people that maybe are slips of the lip, that they didn't mean to say, that there's, especially early on especially in a disappearance where you're really not sure what you're looking at. And it very well could be that Janelle Matthews ran away. It very well could have been. And so early on, if they knew it was a murder from the very first second, then I think that the police and everybody else would have played with the information a lot less.
Yeah.
They would have. But being this was a 12-year-old girl, she could have run off. We now know that came out in the trial that she did not like her parents. She'd made that comment to a best friend. The best friend testified to that in court, and that she was going to skip school the next day. But of course, she disappeared first. This could lend more lead into the idea she was a candidate to run away, even though it was in Colorado in December. And so I think that, Steve infused himself going to the FBI. He probably would have never been considered a suspect otherwise. But being that the police thought, who is this kook? Who is this guy who lives 2 miles away? He doesn't know the Matthews family. Who is he doing this? And so they just kind of start throwing information out at them. That would not surprise me at all. I wasn't there. I don't know. But it would not surprise me at all that some investigator let that slip and Steve remembered it. That anybody thinks, well, they wouldn't have done that, in my opinion, just does not understand these things very well.
Yeah. So the big hang up on that information is, of course, it wasn't officially released publicly, but right. Steve seemed to know that. And that kind of lines up with the information that you spoke about with Ross, that, he dropped off Janelle.
Yes.
That wasn't public information, but somehow Steve seemed to know that as well.
Right.
Yeah. And that, honestly, that could have been, you're right. It could have been one conversation with an agent or a detective somewhere. And that stuff just comes out in a missing persons investigation, just a bit different for sure.
Yep. Like I said, if it was obvious from if they had, the door had been kicked in and they had gone in there and there was blood on the floor, a mirror was cracked, stuff all over the place. There was obviously a fight or something. Then I think that they would have handled the information a lot more carefully. But being that there was no signs of any of that, and it's just a 12-year-old girl who isn't home, I think it's just once again, it's human nature. It's not necessarily the thing for police officers or anybody else. It's just human nature. It's
interesting, that information that you shared about the fact that Janelle was going to skip school the next day. Almost
that came out in the trial.
Yeah, it has me wondering, like, was she in contact with someone that was saying, hey, we're going to spend the whole day together, like possible grooming situation, something along those lines. So
I agree. And these are things that I had never heard until they came out in the trial. Maybe these are things that are well known in Greeley for years. They were news to me.
Yeah.
And that a best friend would say that, I think that gives that information a lot of credence.
Yeah.
That those things should be believed. And then this, once again, it puts more, well, what exactly was going on with Janelle at that time? You have to remember, she wasn't 17.
Right.
She was 12. And she's talking about skipping school. I don't have any kids, but that seems odd to me for a 12-year-old to be talking about skipping school. 17-year-olds, yeah. 12-year-olds, it seems a little strange.
That's a good point. So when she's found in her clothing. It sounds like the jacket actually pulled over her head. Do you know, did they attempt to get any DNA from the clothing?
I'm guessing they did. All I know is no DNA came out at the trial at all.
Okay.
And I think what's interesting about that, it wasn't until, you can view this for what it is, but it wasn't until it was the information actually, I think, out there that they didn't find any DNA. I think that Steve volunteered to say, hey, test my DNA. You won't find it on her. So a lot of people have made a big point about that. Well, the only reason he did that is because he knows that no DNA was found on her already. You could probably look at it that way.
Yeah, that could play either way, actually.
Yep.
So we know publicly he was kind of insinuating, kept pointing his fingers at police. Did that theory come up in the trial at all?
It certainly, it did, because it was in the interview that I did with him. And that was played in court. I was sitting there up on the stand while it was playing, and it certainly came up. But I wasn't asked about it, but it did come up. And certainly the defense attorney, Detective Cash, was on the stand, I think multiple times at a variety of points of the trial, was asked about that. Yeah, it came up, but I'm not saying that there was a mistrial because of that, though. Yeah. That would be hard for me to believe.
Yeah. If you had to pin it on one thing, I guess you already kind of have, but it's really about him not being on the street that night that you think's the weak spot.
I think that's always going to be a problem. You cover disappearances like I do, John, and you know that when we start theorizing about what could have happened, we don't automatically go to a guy who lived 2 miles away, who seemingly has no contact, who had no contact with that family. In fact, what I found strange still to this day, if you can imagine this, is that the Matthews family had never heard of Steve Pankey until Janelle's remains were found in 2019. So for 35 years, the police never asked the Matthews family, hey, we got this guy, Steve Pankey. He keeps coming around. He keeps saying he knows things about Janelle's disappearance. Do you know him? They never did that in 35 years, which still amazes me.
I'm surprised he didn't go out to them, because
that too.
He's reaching out to police. But think about that. He's also reaching out to you. Like, he's reaching out to people he doesn't know to talk about this, but he doesn't. And if we're assuming that he's this kind of whacked out super crime junkie,
yes,
he didn't reach out to the family.
I guess not. That's what they said. That's what they testified to, that they never heard of Steve Pankey until 2019. That's 35 years.
Wow.
So, but what I was saying is that we usually don't default to some guy who lived 2 miles away who didn't know the missing person. What do we usually default to? People in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Neighbors, a friend,
People
somebody
close.
like you said, was somebody grooming her that knew when she would have been home. And that makes sense because what happened? The defense did bring up another possible suspect, this guy, Norris Drake, who conveniently, I guess, is deceased now, but allegedly they lived across the street. He was about Steve's age, in his early 30s. And allegedly for the time that Janelle went missing, he might have left the house, but the two people giving him an alibi are his mother and his sister. Can they be believed? So this all helped the defense.
How heavy did they lean into the Drake theory? Was that about it?
You mean the defense?
Yeah.
Or pretty hard?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that I personally think, although I had very little interaction with his attorney, in fact, the attorney, once the interview was done, he only asked me 2 questions, the defense. I had very little contact with him, but I happen to believe that Steve got a very good defense.
Yeah.
That they were able all these years later to illustrate that the police did look at somebody else at the time in 1984, 1985. Norris Drake was looked at as a possibility as being responsible for Janelle's disappearance. Now, the police dismissed him, but
do we know why?
I'm not sure we know. I don't think we know, though. Well, I think it was the alibi. His sister and his mother were able to give. Well, we were watching this Cosby show, this Christmas show, and it ran from this time to this time, and this would have been the time that Janelle went missing. But you always have to consider the source.
Yeah.
I know that you've covered disappearances where we know that parents are covering for their kids.
Yeah.
We know that. And so you have to look at it, I think, the same way with this. It very well could be that Norris Drake is innocent. But if his alibi is going to be his mother and his sister, and he did leave eventually and didn't come back until the next day, what does that mean?
I thought it was really interesting to see 2 sections of the closing arguments and how effectively you have the prosecution and the defense sort of agreeing on something, and that's really about Steve Pankey's personality. I'm just going to read these here. The prosecution stated, if you think Pankey got on the stand for 2 days and lied to you, he is absolutely guilty of killing Janelle Matthews. In order for you to believe what came from this witness stand out of his mouth, you have to believe this. Not only is he, for some inexplicable reason, fixated on Janelle Matthews, and he made all of this up, but there is a grand conspiracy to convict him. Now, the defense attorney, Anthony Viorst, said, Mr. Pankey, as we've heard, lives in a world of conspiracy, paranoia, and self-esteem issues. By example, this is a man who believes the Greeley and Sun Valley police departments are out to get him. They've got a vendetta. It's probably not accurate, although in his mind it is. I think it's really interesting for the defense attorney to say there's no way that all these police are just out after him. It's probably not accurate. It's all in his mind. But they're sitting in a trial where this murder is being laid at this guy's feet. And then, of course, we have Viorst actually withdraw as Pankey's attorney for whatever comes next. So,
yeah.
It's really interesting because everyone seems to be of the mind, Ed, and you talked to this guy directly. We're talking about a strange bird. We're talking about someone that is kind of attention seeking, was injecting himself into this right from the get-go. And I think there's a real tragedy. Let me just say the first tragedy would be for him to be convicted if he didn't do this. The second tragedy that we might be looking at, especially considering your feelings, is he injected himself in this so hard that the actual culprit got away with it. He was essentially a smokescreen for a criminal.
Yep.
What kind of, true crime junkie would effectively be a tool to help a criminal get away with something?
Well, I think probably if we are to see that, if we are to believe that Steve is innocent, then what he was doing, he didn't know that he was obviously covering up for, somebody else. I don't know if there's any proof that he knew Norris Drake, but there is a precedent that everybody knows, and that's John Mark Carr with John Benet Ramsey. He just came out of nowhere and said, "Oh yeah, I killed her. I did it." Coincidentally, also in the state of Colorado, and they found out he wasn't even in the country when she was murdered. Yeah. And see, I think for us, so that's a situation that the public knows. Right. But for us, John, we know that people are infusing themselves into the cases we cover all the time. People who don't know anything. It's not funny, but it's darkly humorous that we will have a situation where a little girl goes missing. You'll have some 7-Eleven clerk that said, 2 a.m, this little girl who's missing was in here with the guy. And when the guy turned away, she mouthed the words, "Help me." And then, so the clerk calls the police go down there. The lights are flashing. The sirens are blaring. They pull in there. They look at the video and nothing's there. That is common. Yeah. And maybe the public doesn't realize that because not a lot of that gets into the news, but this is common. People infusing themselves in why they love the attention. They actually, in some twisted way, think it's helpful. Yeah. There's a lot of different reasons that I don't necessarily understand, even though I've been doing this for 5 years. And so that has to be considered when you think about a guy like Steve Pankey. That has to be considered. That's not the final judgment on whether he's telling the truth or not, but it's a consideration. And then you look at that, you look at John Mark Carr, you look at other situations where people have infused themselves into well-known crimes, and then obviously they didn't have anything to do with it. It's just not automatically, well, he lied about this and he lied about that, he must be guilty. I think that was the plan the prosecution used, and obviously it only half worked. It seems like some of the jury fell for it and others didn't.
Well, and honestly, it's a mechanism that is kind of drilled into us through popular culture. I mean, I think since back in terms of television, like Perry Mason, like that's the thing. You get one point where you impeach the person on the stand, especially the main person that's being tried. And if you prove they're a liar, boom, that's it. That's it. That they're obviously guilty of everything else. And I think it might be a good thing actually that we're growing away from that simplicity, because sometimes people are incorrect. Sometimes they don't remember the statement they made before, and impeachment doesn't automatically need or mean that they're lying about everything else. So
it certainly does not.
And you're talking about a 70-year-old man. Like, you know what? My memory already, just at my age, not what it used to be. We're talking about a guy that's 70, but I don't know. It's going to be interesting, and it's not done. Basically, at this point, is there going to be a retrial? Well, I told you guys, Viorst withdrew as Pankey's attorney. They did assign a public defender to him. He said that he doesn't have the time or energy to devote to trying the case again, given his small law practice. And I actually watched this clip. He said something about his advanced age, and he looks, I don't know what he's talking about. He looks pretty young to me, but
I saw him up close. I was thinking that he's in his 50s.
That's what I thought too.
Maybe he's 25 and aging fast or something. Maybe the job is not wearing on him well. I'm 51. I thought that he was somewhere in that Gen X.
Yeah. He also said that he was like, when he was trying to explain it to the judge, he was also, and also, considering everything that I've been through this past month, like this trial apparently was really, really hard on him. So he's pulled out.
He's a character. I think I'm allowed to say this, even though I was up on the stand, and of course, maybe people don't realize this, is that the way they do things is that when the trial starts, Steve was brought in handcuffs, and he sat down. They take the handcuffs off him. Then the jury is allowed to come in, so they do not see him in handcuffs, because that might bias them one way. And then when we're going to take a break, the jury leaves, and then Steve is handcuffed and then escorted out once again, because they do not want the jury to see him in handcuffs, because it could be like something subliminal.
Yep.
Well, in one of these situations where the jury was gone, but we were all still there, they were talking about something that was going to be happening at the end of the beginning of the next week. And they were going to have some presentation of evidence without the jury being there. And the defense attorney said something to the judge, well, you know that I'll have some, spectacular argument against that. He did have this kind of wry sense of humor that I noticed while I was there. So I think maybe his statements like that have to be viewed maybe a little bit in that way as well. He did seem like a little bit of a character.
Yeah. So Viorst told the Denver Gazette he continues to believe in Pankey's innocence and hopes a jury will exonerate him in the new trial. So the Colorado Public Defender's Office, they've asked for time to review the case, and they're going to need it because there are 24,000 pages of discovery, 425 audio recordings. One of them we know is 3.5 hours long.
Yes, thank you very much.
22 days worth of trial transcripts that they have to go through now at this point. So what they've done is, it's kind of interesting. Steve has actually pulled out his plea of not guilty because his plea being in place ensures that he should get a speedy trial, that basically they would be going again in 90 days. So he's pulled that plea out so that it relaxes that time frame, because now he's got this new legal team that has to go through all this stuff. And basically what they've agreed to is that they're going to have a status hearing on May 3rd, 2022 to see where this is at and where it's going from there. I think he tried to reduce his bail. They basically said, no, the same bail is going to hold. He's being held on bail or on a $5 million bond. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing to me that they didn't reduce it, being that it was a hung jury. That means at least some people thought he was not guilty, and you'd think that that would be worth something.
Right.
I guess it isn't.
Well, but they don't know. They don't know if it's 11 people that thought he was guilty and one that didn't, or if it was 6 and 6. Like they have no insight into how the split was on the hung jury.
Does that surprise you? That usually comes out after trials that are hung. Does it surprise you? Maybe I don't have as much experience in this area as maybe you have. Does that surprise you in any way?
I do hear about that type of information, but I don't know that I hear about it right after. Like we might hear about that after they conclude the retrial. That jury information seems to come out a little bit later, and someone is going to be the one to write a book.
Yes.
So
somebody wants to get an ebook out of it.
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
Probably.
With
I can tell you the jury makeup, it was something that was, now that I know what happened, but I think I started on trial day 7 and then went into trial day 8, or was it 8 to 9? And I was looking over, and what happens there is that all the juries across the room there, and they have a number in front of them. So juror number 1, 2, and there was no number 12. And I was like, well, what's going on there? Well, it wasn't after when I started reading the articles that occurred before I was on the stand. The juror number 12 had been falling asleep, and this juror was doodling, not taking any notes or anything. And they decided to dismiss that juror. So by the time I was on the stand, juror 12 was already gone.
They didn't roll in.
There was no 12.
They didn't roll in a replacement?
I think they did.
Oh, they just didn't give him a number.
But they just didn't put that juror as number 12. So they just added on a number at the end, like 16 or 17 or something like that.
Gotcha.
But there was no juror number 12. I was like, what's going on with that? Do they not know how to count here in Colorado?
We're not going to get anywhere with this.
Yeah.
One more thing, Ed. We've mentioned the family. I'm sure that they're heartbroken in this. Did you ever get in touch with them? Did they ever contact you in any way? Or
no, I've never spoken to them. I passed them in the trial. They, of course, there. I'm guessing they were there for every day. They were certainly there for the 2 days that I was in the courtroom, but I've never had any conversations with them, simply because, given the situation of what happened, I just tried to be really a neutral party in all of this. Being that Steve reached out to me first, I treated him like any other person that was on Unfound. He got an interview outline. He approved that outline. There were no edits of the interview that I did with him or anything else. So I really just tried to play neutral in all of this. And so that's what I've just continued to do.
But you're right. It is a rough entry point, like knowing that, you were brought into the conversation from this guy saying, I'm a person of interest. Like, the approach to the family after that would be kind of tough. I get that.
Yeah, it's a very odd situation. And certainly the time to introduce myself would not have been during the trial. I think that would have been very inappropriate,
Yeah.
So I just avoided that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I do hope that they're getting through this time okay. And it's kind of terrible that around all this, their timeline is also being stretched now, another 6 months, a reset, thinking that you're getting close to the end of something and having to stare at it, another hill basically after you've just climbed the crest of one. Very tough.
Yeah. I have to admit though, I mean, granted, it would be very difficult for them to be unbiased in all of this.
Yeah.
They certainly want answers. They want somebody to pay for their daughter's murder.
Yeah.
And, Steve is the one who has been charged. But I continue to maintain that as soon as I started looking at what happened before I was on the stand, this very much felt to me like a hung jury.
Yeah.
Unless there were things that were going on in the trial that the Greeley Tribune wasn't writing about, that this just felt like, man, if they find him guilty, it's just going to be because he's a liar. And I just didn't think that was going to be enough. And I know that we are in the area of CSI, that if you cannot DNA, if there's no DNA, if there's no fingerprints, if there's no forensics, no blood evidence and everything else, every prosecutor knows that trying to convict somebody is tough.
Yeah.
If this was the 1970s and this trial occurred, and like you were talking about before, impeaching the witness, showing that he's a liar and everything, might have been enough.
Yeah.
Not in 2021.
Yep.
Not going to get it done. And is that good or bad? I think it varies from case to case. In this one, if you believe Steve Pankey's guilty, then it's bad. If you believe that he's innocent, maybe it's not so bad.
Right. Well, I know we've got all kinds of opinions out there. Let's talk about it in the comments down below. As always, I ask that we remain respectful. Also, while you're down there, give a shout out to Ed Dentzel, and a big thank you, Ed, for joining us here today. Ed, where can people find you in Unfound?
Well, we're everywhere podcasts can be found. iTunes, Spotify. We recently got featured on Amazon in their, New Gems or Hidden Gems section of their podcast site on Amazon, Facebook, the page, the discussion group, the website, theunfoundpodcast.com, on Twitter. And we've talked about Patreon during this talk today, patreon.com/unfound podcast.
What do you guys think? I know Ed is on one side of the fence. I feel like I might be on the other side, but I don't know. I'm kind of split down the middle after this conversation today. I can tell you when we made the case cracked, things looked pretty clear. Things don't look as clear from this vantage point. I really wish that there was some physical evidence in this case to help bring the truth, because without that, the question of reasonable doubt is going to be a big, strong question. I also wanted to thank 9news.com, the Denver Gazette, KDVR, and of course the Greeley Tribune for all of their coverage of the trial. Another reminder, no shows next week. We're taking the week off, but we'll be back right after that. Hope you all have a safe and enjoyable time. We'll see you again the following Monday on a new episode of Case Cracked right here on the Lord and Arts channel.